My name is Brian Stevenson, and my academic trajectory concluded at the prestigious halls of Harvard Law School, where my peers were scrambling to secure high-paying corporate partnerships in Wall Street. I packed my absolute existence into a battered sedan, driving south toward the sweltering, suffocating humidity of Monroe County, Alabama, in 1989. This geographical defection was not an act of naive youthful idealism, but a calculated counterattack against a legal architecture designed to systematically execute underprivileged citizens. My mother frame trembled when I informed her of my permanent relocation to the Deep South, a territory where the historical blood of my ancestors was still preserved in the red clay soil. I established a small nonprofit defense organization with zero capital, occupying a damp office above a local grocery store where the scent of rotting produce mingled with the heavy ink of federal appeal templates. My initial confrontation with the systemic machinery of state-sanctioned execution materialized inside the sterile gray corridors of Holman State Prison. I walked through 5 sequential heavy steel security gates, my leather briefcase containing nothing but a blank legal pad and an absolute commitment to human sovereignty. The guards escorted a man named Walter McMillian into the visitation cage, his tall frame bent by the heavy weight of silver chains and 2 years of absolute isolation on death row. Walter looked at my young, unlined face with a profound, crushing apathy, telling me that a black man in Alabama did not need a lawyer from Harvard, he needed a miracle to escape the electric chair. I looked into his bloodshot eyes, promising him that my office would analyze every single syllable of his trial transcripts until the state machinery collapsed under its own institutional deception. The local authorities in Monroeville maintained a bizarre cultural fixation on the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, celebrating the fictional legacy of racial justice while actively maintaining a modern system of legal enslavement. The local district attorney, a ruthless career politician named Tommy Chapman, viewed my legal presence as an intolerable intrusion into the absolute authority of his office. He warned me during a private conference at the courthouse that reopening the Walter McMillian case would disturb the social peace of the community, suggesting that an outside lawyer should return to New England before his professional reputation suffered a fatal accident. I stood my ground on the historic marble steps, realizing that the entire town had utilized a fictional book to mask the real blood dripping from their modern judicial chambers. The financial and physical foundation of the state case against Walter rested entirely on the manufactured testimony of a convicted felon named Ralph Myers. Myers was a deeply unstable white criminal who had been threatened with the electric chair himself unless he fabricated a story linking Walter to the brutal murder of a young white dry-cleaning clerk. I tracked Myers down to a high-security psychiatric prison facility, entering his cell after hours with a digital tape recorder tucked inside my suit vest. After 3 hours of intense psychological pressure, Myers collapsed into absolute hysterics, confessing that the local sheriff had locked him in a room with a death row inmate for a week until he agreed to sign the falsified affidavit against Walter. The social backlash against my legal organization escalated into direct physical violence as the local police forces began tracking my movements after my evening shifts at the prison. I was driving back to my apartment late one Saturday night when 2 unmarked police cruisers forced my sedan off the dark rural highway, their high beams blinding my vision. 2 white deputy sheriffs pulled me out of the vehicle at gunpoint, slamming my frame against the hot metal hood while they searched my briefcase for confidential witness statements. They held a cold revolver cylinder against my temple, whispering that a Harvard education would not protect a colored boy from disappearing into the swamps if he continued to question the integrity of the state courts. Instead of retreating into compliance, I moved my primary legal operations into the local colored church, transforming the small wooden basement into an absolute fortress of defensive counter-law. Walter family and dozens of local citizens gathered every evening to help me catalog the physical alibi evidence that the original defense team had completely ignored. We established that on the precise day of the murder, Walter was hosting a public fish fry at his home, surrounded by 30 independent witnesses who had seen his frame cooking food miles away from the crime scene. I realized that the state had not merely committed a minor administrative error, they had deliberately chosen to incinerate an innocent black man to satisfy the public demand for a quick conviction. District Attorney Tommy Chapman launched aggressive procedural counteroffensive, utilizing expensive legal delays to block our motion for a new evidentiary hearing before the state Supreme Court. He flooded my small office with hundreds of frivolous motions, attempting to drain our minimal financial reserves and force our organization into involuntary bankruptcy. I spent 18 hours a day writing legal briefs on my old typewriter, my fingers bleeding from the repetitive stress, while my assistant managed the terrifying phone calls from anonymous white supremacy groups. We survived the administrative assault through the sheer precision of our structural analysis, filing a federal civil rights petition that forced the local court to schedule a public hearing. The public evidentiary hearing inside the Monroeville courthouse became a historical showdown between the old segregationist establishment and the modern forces of constitutional law. The state deployed state troopers to block our family from entering the courtroom, filling the spectator benches with armed white deputies to create an atmosphere of heavy intimidation. I called Ralph Myers to the witness stand, my voice echoing through the historic chamber as I forced him to repeat his confession regarding the police coercion before the presiding judge. The district attorney cross-examined him with absolute ferocity, but Myers held his position, stating under oath that his original testimony was a complete and absolute lie manufactured by the state. Despite the absolute collapse of the state primary witness and the ironclad alibi provided by 30 independent citizens, the local judge delivered a crushing administrative ruling that denied our motion for a new trial. He stated in his written opinion that the newly discovered evidence was insufficient to disturb the original jury verdict, a flagrant display of judicial corruption that left Walter family weeping in the marble hallways. I stood frozen at the defense table, looking at the smug satisfaction on the faces of the local prosecutors who believed they had successfully validated their legal murder trap. I walked back to my car in the freezing rain, realizing that the local courts were completely immune to the truth. I traveled to New York to coordinate a massive national media campaign with the producers of 60 Minutes, exposing the raw, unvarnished corruption of the Alabama judicial system to millions of international viewers. We broadcasted the recorded confessions of Ralph Myers alongside interviews with Walter alibi witnesses, transforming a local racial tragedy into a massive national scandal that paralyzed the public relations apparatus of the state. The sudden influx of international scrutiny forced the State Attorney General Office to launch an independent internal review of the case, bypassing the corrupt local district attorney and establishing a new trajectory for our legal defense. The psychological atmosphere inside death row grew dangerously volatile as Walter's execution date approached, with the prison administration restricting his access to legal counsel as a form of institutional punishment. I spent my mornings navigating the complex federal bureaucracy to secure emergency stay orders, my mind mapping the technical execution protocols while I fought to keep my client alive. The guards systematically searched Walter's cell, confiscating his personal legal notes and threatening to place his frame in solitary confinement if he continued to communicate with the media. We maintained our operational connection through a network of sympathetic colored kitchen workers who smuggled our legal correspondences inside bread baskets. I filed a comprehensive 100-page petition for a writ of habeas corpus before the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, citing massive structural constitutional violations during the original trial. I proved that the local prosecutor had deliberately excluded minority citizens from the jury pool, creating an all-white panel that was culturally predisposed to convicting a colored defendant without physical evidence. This federal intervention shifted the legal battlefield away from the corrupt local courthouse of Monroeville, placing the case before a panel of objective federal judges who were completely detached from the local political dynamics of Alabama. A devastating bomb threat targeted our Montgomery office headquarters on a Tuesday afternoon, forcing the local police department to evacuate the entire residential block. A sophisticated explosive device was located inside a cardboard box delivered to our front door, its wiring configuration indicating an intentional attempt to terminate our legal team. Instead of halting our research, I relocated our primary legal servers to a secure underground facility beneath a university library, continuing our preparation for the federal oral arguments without missing a single filing deadline. This domestic terrorism only served to solidify my absolute resolve, proving that our legal strategies had penetrated the inner circle of the white supremacy network. I walked into the office of the governor of Alabama, demanding an immediate executive commutation of Walter's death sentence based on the absolute fraudulent nature of the trial records. The governor sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture projecting an absolute political indifference as he reminded me that his conservative voting base demanded swift executions to maintain law and order. He offered to delay the execution by 30 days as a political compromise, an administrative insult that I immediately rejected before the gathered press corps outside his chambers. I informed the journalists that the state executive branch was actively participating in illegal lynching, a declaration that triggered a massive public protest on the steps of the state capitol. The Federal Court of Appeals delivered a historic unanimous ruling that completely invalidated the original conviction of Walter McMillian, citing the flagrant suppression of exculpatory evidence by the local prosecutors. The federal judges commanded the state of Alabama to either conduct an immediate new trial under strict federal oversight or release the defendant from state custody permanently. This massive legal victory shattered the confidence of the local district attorney office, forcing Tommy Chapman to schedule an emergency meeting to evaluate his remaining political options. I received the federal order at my desk, my hands shaking as I realized we had successfully broken the primary gears of the state execution machine. The state attempted a final desperate maneuver to salvage their case by launching an aggressive reinvestigation of Walter Alibi witnesses, threatening them with perjury charges if they repeated their testimonies in federal court. I spent a week traveling through the rural dirt roads of Monroe County, reinforcing the courage of the local colored community and securing formal legal protection for our witnesses from the Department of Justice. We compiled a massive array of physical documentation, including utility receipts and employment logs, that mathematically verified the exact location of every single witness on the day of the crime, rendering the state intimidation tactics completely useless. A former local police dispatcher, a white woman who had been fired for questioning the sheriff methods, secretly contacted my office to deliver a massive cache of hidden audio recordings from the original investigation night. Tapes revealed that the local police had received 3 separate tips identifying the actual white killer, but the sheriff had deliberately destroyed the records to focus the investigation on Walter because of his private romantic relationship with a white woman. This explosive discovery provided the final missing link in our counterattack, proving that the entire case was a premeditated conspiracy to execute an innocent citizen for violating the social codes of the Old South. The state officially abandoned its plans to conduct a new trial, realizing that the presentation of our newly discovered evidence would result in a massive federal prosecution of their own law enforcement officers. District Attorney Tommy Chapman joined my frame before the bench of the local circuit court, his face pale with absolute political humiliation as he formally moved to dismiss all criminal charges against Walter McMillian. I stood beside Walter at the defense table, his tall frame no longer bound by silver chains, his posture straight and his eyes filled with the brilliant light of absolute vindication. The judge signed the release order with a trembling hand, marking the formal termination of a 6-year legal nightmare. Walter McMillian walked out of the front doors of the Monroeville courthouse as a completely free man, stepping into the bright Alabama afternoon sun, where hundreds of weeping supporters were waiting to embrace his frame. The historical significance of the moment was overwhelming, as the very steps that had been used to enforce segregation for a century became the stage for an absolute triumph of racial and constitutional justice. I walked behind him, my briefcase light, my heart feeling a profound permanent peace that validated every single drop of blood and sweat we had expended in the trenches of the Deep South. Following his release, Walter returned to his rural home to resume his independent timber business, but the psychological scars left by his years on death row had permanently altered his physical constitution. He began suffering from advanced early-onset dementia, a devastating medical consequence of the prolonged trauma and fear of execution he had endured inside the state prison system. I visited his home regularly, sitting with him on his wooden porch while he confused the sound of the wind with the heavy footsteps of the prison guards. I realized that the state had not merely stolen his freedom, they had systematically destroyed his mind, a lingering atrocity that forced my organization to expand our fight for criminal justice reform across the entire nation. The United States Senate Judiciary Committee summoned my frame to Washington to deliver expert testimony on the systemic racial biases embedded within the application of the death penalty. I stood before the national lawmakers, utilizing the technical metrics of the Walter McMillian case to prove that for every 9 executions executed in the United States, 1 innocent person on death row was discovered and released. I demanded a total federal moratorium on capital punishment, forcing the conservative senators to look at the physical photographs of the innocent men who had been saved from the electric chair by our nonprofit organization. My testimony resulted in the passage of the Innocence Protection Act, expanding federal funding for DNA testing and legal defense services across the country. The national media exposure transformed our small Montgomery office into a prestigious legal training center, attracting brilliant young law graduates from Yale, Stanford, and Columbia who wanted to join our crusade against the death penalty. We expanded our operational scope, taking on 40 new capital cases across the Deep South and establishing a permanent network of civil rights attorneys inside the most hostile jurisdictions of the country. I spent my days mentoring the young lawyers, teaching them to look past the arrogant legal structures of the state and find the human sovereignty hidden beneath the legal definitions of the transcripts. I returned to Holman State Prison to represent an elderly white inmate named Anthony Ray Hinton, who had spent nearly 30 years in solitary confinement for a series of restaurant robberies he did not commit. Hinton's case carried an absolute identical structural corruption to Walter, resting entirely on a flawed ballistics report manufactured by a corrupt state laboratory technician. I spent 12 years fighting his case through the state courts, my hair turning gray alongside his as we repeatedly faced the identical administrative arrogance that had nearly executed Walter. When the United States Supreme Court finally issued a unanimous summary reversal that freed Hinton, he walked out of the prison gates and immediately hugged my frame, proving that our fight for mercy transcended the boundaries of race. I stood before the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States to argue a historic case challenging the constitutionality of sentencing children to mandatory life without parole sentences. I represented a young colored boy named Evan Miller, who had been sentenced to die in prison for a non-premeditated crime committed when he was only 14 years old. I argued before the 9 Supreme Justices that a system devoid of mercy for children was a system that had completely surrendered its moral legitimacy to the animal instincts of vengeance. The Supreme Court delivered a landmark 5-4 ruling that banned mandatory life sentences for juveniles, retroactively transforming the destinies of thousands of young inmates across the entire country. We established the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, creating a permanent historical monument dedicated to the thousands of African American victims of racial terror lynchings across the United States. The memorial featured 800 massive hanging steel columns, each engraved with the names of the counties and the specific individuals who had been murdered by white supremacy mobs during the Jim Crow era. I walked through the corridors of the monument, looking at the rusted steel reflecting the southern sky, realizing that the fight for modern judicial reform was completely inseparable from the historical recognition of our nation's past atrocities. The physical decline of Walter McMillian concluded on a quiet morning in September 2013, when his fragile frame passed away peacefully inside a local hospice center surrounded by his loving family. I sat beside his bed during his final hours, holding his worn collah's hands as his breathing slowed into a permanent silence. His funeral service was attended by thousands of citizens, including several converted state officials who had originally participated in his prosecution, but had been transformed by his profound grace and resilience. I delivered the final eulogy, informing the assembly that Walter had taught the world that the true measure of a society is not how we treat the rich and the powerful, but how we extend our legal organization, now officially designated as the Equal Justice Initiative, grew into a massive national institution, with over 100 full-time staff members managing thousands of active civil rights cases across the globe. We launched a comprehensive data platform that mapped every single illegal execution and racial injustice event in American history, providing independent researchers with free access to the unredacted historical truth. My role shifted from a simple local trial lawyer to a global strategic leader, traveling to international human rights conferences to share our methodology for dismantling institutional oppression through the precise application of constitutional law. The administration of Harvard Law School invited my frame to return to the university to deliver the prestigious commencement address to the graduating class of 2018. I stood before the thousands of elite students in their black academic gowns, looking at the very platform I had left 30 years ago to venture into the dangerous trenches of Alabama. I challenged the new generation of lawyers to reject the comfortable illusions of corporate wealth and use their expensive degrees to stand in the gaps with the broken, the poor, and the falsely accused. My speech resulted in a historic standing ovation, inspiring dozens of young graduates to abandon their corporate contracts. The state of Alabama officially declassified the internal investigation records of the Walter McMillian case, confirming that our legal counterattacks had systematically exposed a 30-year history of institutional racism and evidence tampering within the state trooper network. The documents proved that our precise application of constitutional law had saved not just Walter, but had permanently altered the administrative protocols for capital investigations across the entire country. I sat on the porch of my Montgomery office holding the final reports, the warm afternoon sun illuminating the text, realizing that our small non-profit organization had successfully rewritten the legal history of the American Republic. The declassification of the Walter Macmillan dossier triggered a massive national demand for institutional accountability, pushing my organization to launch a direct legal assault against the doctrine of sovereign immunity. This controversial protective shield had traditionally allowed corrupt prosecutors and law enforcement officers in Alabama to evade personal, financial, and criminal liability for fabricating evidence. I drafted a historic civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Walter Estate, targeting the specific estate funds of the retired sheriff who had orchestrated the original conspiracy. The state defense attorneys attempted to dismiss our petition by We utilized the financial resources from the historic settlement to establish the Deep South Coalition for Criminal Justice, uniting independent defense organizations across Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana under our strategic command. This massive expansion allowed us to deploy rapid response legal teams to rural courthouses where minority defendants were still being rushed through biased trial procedures without adequate representation. I spent months traveling between regional capitals, establishing automated digital databases that tracked the selection patterns of local jury pools to instantly detect racial discrimination before the trials even commenced. This proactive counter-law network Our legal organization launched a comprehensive independent investigation into the structural and sanitary conditions of the state-run maximum security facilities, discovering a horrific pattern of institutional neglect and violence. We secretly gathered thousands of pages of internal medical records and witness testimonies from inmates inside Donaldson Correctional Facility, proving that the administration was deliberately allowing overcrowding to trigger inmate violence as a method of population control. I presented the explosive forensic evidence before a federal oversight committee, forcing the Department of Justice to file a historic civil rights lawsuit against the entire state of Alabama for violating the Eighth Amendment. This structural intervention transformed. The prison administration attempted to execute a severely traumatized mentally ill inmate named Jesse Tafero, utilizing a faulty electric chair that had not been inspected by independent engineers for over a decade. I received an emergency midnight call from the prison kitchen, learning that the first execution attempt had resulted in horrific physical torture due to a mechanical malfunction in the voltage delivery system. I drove to the state capitol under an absolute downpour, filing an emergency federal injunction on the steps of the Supreme Court building while the executioners prepared a second attempt. The federal judge granted our motion with only 7 minutes remaining on the death warrant, allowing our medical team to conduct. The elite law schools of Europe and Asia began coordinating with our Montgomery headquarters, creating an international recruitment underground that brought brilliant foreign human rights scholars to work in our research divisions. These international attorneys brought advanced concepts of comparative international law to our domestic briefs, arguing that the execution of underprivileged citizens in the American South was a direct violation of international human rights treaties. This sophisticated academic infusion elevated our legal filings to an unprecedented level of global authority, forcing the state courts to recognize that their local judicial decisions were being actively scrutinized by the. We expanded our cultural infrastructure by launching an interactive digital platform called the Racial Terror Map, which documented every single documented extrajudicial lynching executed in the United States between 1877 and 1950. Our research team spent 3 years digging through forgotten local newspaper archives and county cemetery records, revealing over 800 previously unrecorded atrocities across the Black Belt. This historical preservation project was met with intense local hostility, with conservative state senators threatening to revoke our non-profit tax status for inciting social division. I initiated a massive class action lawsuit against the predatory municipal court systems of several Alabama cities, which were utilizing excessive cash bail requirements to systematically incarcerate poor citizens for minor traffic violations. This predatory financial loop had effectively transformed local jails into debtors' prisons, destroying the economic stability of thousands of working-class minority families who could not afford the administrative fees. We argued before the state Supreme Court that the privatization of bail bonds was an unconstitutional commercialization of human liberty that violated the Equal Protection Clause. Our legal teams launched the Elderly Release Program, targeting the immediate commutation of sentences for geriatric inmates who had spent over 40 years in prison for non-violent property crimes committed during their youth. We compiled comprehensive medical data proving that these elderly citizens pose zero recidivism risk to the public and that their continued incarceration was costing the state treasury millions of dollars in medical expenses. I personally escorted a 70-year-old blind inmate named Walter Hill out of the prison gates after the shifting political landscape of Alabama finally forced the newly elected moderate governor to officially invite my frame to serve as the chief advisor for the State Judicial Reform Commission. I accepted the executive appointment on one absolute condition, that our committee would possess the unredacted authority to review every single active capital case currently pending on the state execution docket. This historic political alignment allowed us to implement comprehensive blind review protocols for ballistics and DNA. I stood on the roof terrace of the Equal Justice Initiative headquarters looking out at the golden sunset illuminating the rolling waters of the Alabama River, the exact historical site where tens of thousands of enslaved citizens had been unloaded from domestic steamships a century ago. The small, damp office above the grocery store had transformed into a massive, unassailable fortress of constitutional law, its structural legacy permanently etched into the legal architecture of the entire republic. The threats of violence, the narrative structure rejects any form of theatrical artifice, concluding with absolute clinical realism inside the quiet, empty courtroom of the Alabama Supreme Court at midnight. Brian Stevenson appears sitting alone at the primary defense table, his formal tailored suit immaculate while his physical posture remains remarkably rigid, completely devoid of the old survival anxiety that had once dictated his early movements in the rural counties. In his right hand he holds a single worn legal pad, its pages filled with the handwritten names of the hundreds of death row inmates his organization has successfully rescued from the electric chair over the past 3 decades. The ambient lighting of the judicial chamber drops by a single precise octave as the automated climate control units shift into their late-night power conservation configurations, leaving the massive wood-paneled room illuminated entirely by the silver glare of the distant streetlights streaming through the tall frosted windows. He does not offer a final dramatic monologue or look toward the empty judge's bench, choosing instead to close his leather briefcase with a single sharp, decisive click that echoes through the vacant hall, his lips parting into a faint phantom smile that celebrates the absolute completion of his transition from a lone vulnerable advocate into an unassailable monument of constitutional justice. The camera remains completely stationary, locking onto his calm, serene eyes for 5 long, suspended seconds of profound psychological resolution before the final exterior streetlight flickers once on the marble columns.